Hey, it's excellent to be here. Look forward to a great conversation. I've got some prepared slides that we'll discuss by way of kind of setting the framework for how to think about these issues. But for me, my favorite part of these events is certainly the interaction and the questions and kind of the discussion at the end. So by way of my background, basically I've been focused on cybersecurity and other forms of risk for the past 25 years. A few of the organizations that I've been affiliated with or founded or co-founded on this slide, varying from boutique cybersecurity companies to terrorism research to helping start the first cyber threat intelligence entity. So the reality is that I have a great deal of experience dealing with real world cyber problems. So what we talk about today, I'm going to keep grounded in reality. We're not going to allow for any Tom Clancy-esque scenarios. Well, the real world problems are big enough as they are, so that's where we'll keep our focus. I'm also incredibly excited because matrix slides are going to be back in vogue again after 20 years. It's the moment I've been waiting for for a long time. So we're going to take the red pill today. We're going to take the reality and kind of exit the matrix and talk about not only the threats that we're facing, but the framework for kind of future threats that we're dealing with, and set the context with thinking about a question that I asked colleagues 25 years ago, and it was around a particular facility, and I wanted them to know, is this a hard target or a soft target? And I know the interaction is difficult, so normally I would throw to the audience, but when we talk about a hard target from a protection standpoint, it is something where we are going to protect it with guards and guns and gates and make it ultra secure, whereas a soft target is something that we're maybe protecting from an information attack perspective that maybe can be targeted without attacking it or without bombing it. And I asked a very simple question 25 years ago about a facility that's located nearby me, about 60 miles away, called the Mount Pony facility in Culpeper, Virginia. And as you can see, it's located in the side of a mountain. It's a secure facility designed to withstand nuclear attack, protected very much like a hard target, but was listed as a piece of our critical infrastructure in the United States. And that got my attention because it was a likely target for engaging in some sort of cyber terrorist attack. In fact, with a good friend of mine, we, on one Valentine's Day, 1 year, decided we would do our own kind of open source assessment of this facility. This is the kit that we built. You can see the old laptops and the radio and the Diet Coke and the beef jerky. The objective was to look suspicious. So I'm sitting in the back of the car with my black leather jacket and my sunglasses and a t-shirt that said 1984, we're behind schedule. And we wanted to figure out, what was this facility? Oh, there I am twice. Interesting. And is it a hard target or a soft target? It caught our attention because it was being covered in the news. It was being covered in academic journals. It was in Wired magazine, if you're familiar with Wired magazine. In fact, Wired magazine was interesting in that they produced a list that they called their scared shit list. And I apologize for the profanity. It's theirs, not mine. And they listed the top 10 infrastructure targets in the United States. What are the 10 things you could go after that would have the most substantial impact in the US? And this facility in Culpeper, Virginia, the 60, 75 miles away from Washington, D.C., was their #1 target. And we were trying to figure out why. We determined that the first role that this facility played was a continuity of government operations facility. That's why it was built into the side of a mountain. That's why it was designed to withstand a nuclear attack. It had a shooting range, it had an incinerator, it had backup generators, and there was a certain number of government employees in the event of some sort of catastrophic attack in the US that were going to go there and try and maintain the continuity of government operations. But that wasn't why it was listed as a critical infrastructure target. The second role that it played in life was actually a storage of currency. It was storing real cash dollar bills with enough money there to reconstitute the economy east of the Mississippi River in the event, again, that there was some sort of catastrophic attack. So zombie apocalypse happens, we've determined that we need cash, and this was going to be used by the government to regenerate cash into the economy on the assumption that our cash printing presses would be down and we would need to do something drastic. But that also was not the reason why it was listed as a top critical infrastructure target. It was actually the third role that this facility played that constituted it being listed as a critical infrastructure target. And that was that it was a Federal Reserve switch. So if you don't know a lot about the federal banking system, they're the Federal Reserve banks, and they exchange very large amounts of money amongst each other. And at that point in time, there was a single switch that was interconnecting them all. And when I say switch, think of it's almost like an expansion of your home router. There were cables coming in, it was routing traffic in between those banks, serving this purpose of electronic funds transfer. So a very vital role that it was playing. And obviously, if that goes down, the banks can't exchange money and it has a drastic impact on the economy. So that's why it was being listed as this critical infrastructure target. And it was protected like a hard target. We put it in this bunker that was underground, that was designed to withstand nuclear attack. But what was the reality associated with that particular target? The reality is that a switch is no good unless it connects to something. It was connecting to these Federal Reserve banks, and it was doing so over the public switch telephone network. And at the time, that public switch telephone network was incredibly vulnerable. In fact, there were numerous hackers in my Rolodex that could break into the public switch telephone network and route themselves across different public and private networks. So we had put this switch inside this bunker, but in reality, it really was a soft target. And I remember briefing this and this being kind of a transition point for a lot of my colleagues and understanding the consequences of what we're dealing with today. And that is that most of what we are dependent on from a critical infrastructure perspective is being run and operated by computers. That is the why do we care, right? What infrastructures do you depend on? And when we think about that in just the context of our daily lives, the internet, right? We're dependent on the internet right now to engage in this session. Internet has become the backbone of commerce, of culture, of education. It's incredibly relied on. Electric power, we refer to as a supercritical infrastructure. If the power is down, none of this other fancy stuff works. Our computers aren't working, they're not connecting to the internet. Eventually, the cell phone tower backup batteries die and your cell phone battery dies. So electric power is certainly something that we use and rely on every single day. Banking and finance, we talked about this switch that was being used by the Federal Reserve to exchange money. Maybe you have some cash in your wallet right now, maybe you don't, but it is high likelihood is that the vast majority of the representation of wealth that you have or that your parents have or that your family have or that others have is dependent on what is being stored in computers, ones and zeros, and how much those computers in databases say you have. We don't have physical currency or physical gold to match the wealth that we've created in society. Transportation, another one, right? We are all using some form of transportation every day, whether it's public transportation, driving in a car, hopping on an airplane or a train, another critical infrastructure. What do all of those have in common? They are all controlled by computers. Every infrastructure that we are dependent on today has some element and often a very major component that is controlled by computers that are connected to networks. And this has created a new dynamic for us with regards to how we think about national security. Because if those critical infrastructures are controlled by computers and an adversary wants to have an impact on us, they can target the computers. They don't need to bomb us. They don't need to invade us. They can engage in cyber attacks against that critical infrastructure and take advantage of that inherent vulnerability that those systems have. We are over time and have become increasingly dependent on technology, whether it's these critical infrastructures or just the software and applications that you use every day. So it's changed the dynamic about how we think about national security to now include elements of cyber attack. A great way to think about critical infrastructure protection and targeting them is to just create this little, 4-node matrix where we have targets that can be physical and we have targets that can be digital, and we have tools that we can use to attack them, that also can be either physical or digital. So let's step through them real quick. Physical on physical, that would be a conventional terrorism or conventional attack. Pretty easy to understand. Physical on digital, a little bit different, but it's where a terrorist group or other adversary might use known techniques to target digital infrastructure. What's a good example of that? I live in Ashburn, Virginia. For those that aren't familiar, Ashburn, Virginia is as close to having a center of the internet as you can get. We have a ton of interconnection points between the ISPs, a lot of Amazon, Microsoft, Google infrastructure located here. They are in these big warehouses, lots of switches, lots of interconnection points. I might not know how to hack into that environment, but I know that I want to degrade the capability of those peering points or of those data centers, and I might use a physical attack in order to engage in that. That's where we blow stuff up to target the digital systems or databases that are being stored. We also have a digital to physical, right? We just talked about some of those infrastructures like transportation being physical in nature. And we might use a cyber attack in order to disrupt those physical infrastructures. This is the realm of movies that we see that are out there where the hackers break into infrastructure and they cause physical harm. I got 3 up here, you know, branching back over 25 years, where there was some sort of cyber attack that had some sort of physical impact and some sort of Hollywood scenario, although we don't see these types of attacks as frequently in the real world. And then there's what we call the pure cyber attack. The physical on physical, or sorry, the cyber on cyber, where we're using cyber attack mechanisms to go after a cyber attack target. So it's a digital tool against a digital target. That is kind of the purest form and what we hear about when we talk about cyber attack information warfare in the most common context in today's environment. Talk a little bit about some of the threats and threat actor motivations and kind of what is happening out there in today's environment. The first is intellectual property theft. So there are a lot of entities, government sponsored and non-government sponsored, that are trying to steal secrets that are basically the secret sauce around a particular electronic device, around a particular pharmaceutical formula, where the company has invested a ton of money in research and development, wants to take that product to market to get the return on that research and development, or maybe even represent some sort of national security technology. And there are, as I said, a very diverse group of attackers that are engaging in intellectual property theft. So they're using a cyber attack, hacking into computers to steal secrets, and then using those secrets to build and replicate those technologies on their own. Another aspect of cyber attack, cyber crime. We hear about this every single day in the newspaper. Why do cyber criminals engage in cyber crime? Well, there's a famous Willie Sutton quote where he asked, why do bank robbers rob banks? And he replied, it's because it's where the money is. Where is our money today? We just talked about it. It's stored in computers, it's in applications, it's in online bank accounts. So criminal actors are turning to cybercrime in order to steal that money. And we see lots of variations of these types of attacks, from simple things like trying to convince you that you have a cousin that's stuck in London that needs money to get out of jail, to sophisticated attacks where they break directly into banking systems and steal money out of customer accounts, to credit card fraud. So there's a wide variety and huge diversity of ways in which cybercrime is used to target public and private organizations. Ransomware, this is a big one. I worked my first ransomware case almost 20 years ago, and it was a much different environment back then. So what has changed? What has made ransomware so much more of a prevalent threat today than it was 20 years ago? And it really is one, we've created this ecosystem of computers being connected together and exposed on networks, combined with a very easy / facilitated payment mechanism with cryptocurrencies. So when I worked a ransomware case 20 years ago, They might have broken in and encrypted data and said, you have to pay us a ransom in order to get the key back. But then the question became, how do you pay the bad guy? How do you pay the ransom? Well, it was very difficult. You couldn't give them a credit card. You couldn't do a bank wire. They would try and direct you to some, Russian organized crime version of PayPal. But all of the U.S. banks and credit card companies were savvy to that entity, and they wouldn't let you send money there. So it was very difficult for the attackers to monetize ransomware. Today, with cryptocurrencies, with Bitcoin and others, they have a very simple way. They can provide you with instructions. Some of these ransomware gangs give you an 800 number that you can call if you need help in paying the ransom. And you go on to a cryptocurrency exchange and it takes your credit card and you get your Bitcoin and you send your ransom and you get your key to decrypt your files. That's a very simple mechanism for individual attacks and even for some of the corporate attacks. But then we also see these massive ransomware attacks. These massive ransomware attacks that are demanding 20, 30, $50 million in ransom in order to restore operations to those computer systems or give the company their data back. We also have this issue of kind of cascading failures and dependencies in ransomware. Ransomware is a little bit non-discriminatory. If it sees a vulnerable system, it might exploit it. What if that vulnerable system is in a hospital? What if that vulnerable system is associated with billing for gas going across a pipeline, which is what we saw with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware. So you start to have these denial of service type impacts that can, impact public safety if you're going after a hospital, or impact the economy and our infrastructure. I can tell you during the Colonial Pipeline attack here in Northern Virginia, it took me about 5 gas stations until I was able to fill up my car. The impact was fairly real and very substantial with regards to the gas shortages that we suffered. A little bit of that was a self-inflicted wound because people that didn't need gas went and got gas, and we had this kind of cascading public perception about a commodity that was basically weren't going to have easy access to. If people had just maintained their regular behavior, then we might have been able to weather it a little bit more easy. But ransomware is still one of the most significant attacks and threats that entities are facing today. Espionage. Why did bank robbers move into cyberspace? Because it's where the money is. Why did spies move into cyberspace? Because it's where we are. It is where we are living our lives. It is where we are communicating with each other. It's where we are spending our money. So it is just a natural progression of espionage that the spies will also move into cyberspace. And we see that again at grand scale. Where individuals are being targeted, systems are being targeted in order to collect information about us, platforms are being exploited in order to gather information around us. We have created with some of these social media platforms, the greatest intelligence collection capability that the world has ever seen. Facebook with 3 billion plus users with intimate details. In fact, you can make an argument for most of us that these social networks know more about us than we know about ourselves. And if you don't think that is true, just take a couple of days and focus on the predictive advertising that you're getting on Facebook or Instagram or some of these other platforms. So naturally, the spies are in cyberspace and will continue to be over time. We also have a threat category that is basically a leaking of information. So we talked about ransomware and them wanting to lock up your files and prevent you from getting access to them in exchange for money to get back access to your systems and to your data. We have also a category of attackers that are breaking in and stealing secrets with the sole intent of publishing those secrets in the public domain, diminishing the value of that IP, causing embarrassment, causing discord around diplomacy efforts. We've seen over the past 15 to 20 years just a very wide variety of secrets that are being leaked. Some are done by activists, some are done by criminals, and some are done by state sponsors pretending to be activists or criminals, right? So it's also used as a real information warfare tactic to get stuff into the public domain. So how does this kind of all come together? What is the risk as you see these attacks, or for an individual just like myself? And I use this example from 2015. where I got breach notification letters from 3 organizations. One was Anthem, which had my health records. Second was Experian, which had my credit records, bank accounts, cars, mortgages, credit cards. And the third was the Office of Personnel Management in the government, which alerted me to the fact that a document called an SF-86 that you fill out in order to obtain a clearance in the US government had been compromised. And for those unfamiliar with an SF-86, you provide all of your personal information. You provide personal information about your immediate family, spouses, children, parents, in-laws. You provide your travel history. You provide all sorts of sensitive information. So just think about if you are a spy or a criminal trying to target Matt Devost. 2015 was a banner year. You know almost everything that you need to know about me. What's missing on here? Sure, there was no Facebook breach, but I'm sure that they're trolling my Facebook profile and seeing what movies that I like and what books that I'm reading. But it starts to become a very complete data picture as these entities become breached from an individual impact perspective. They now can fine tune this information to try and steal my identity, to target me with social engineering and other tactics. So it becomes a real risk over time. And that brings us to the domain of cyber conflict. Again, we talked about the bank robbers, the criminals moving to cyberspace. We talked about the spies moving to cyberspace. Now we're also talking about conflict moving to cyberspace, where now nations will be enabled, empowered to engage in cyber conflict against each other, where we can use those cyber attack techniques to target the cyber systems in other nations to have some sort of strategic impact. If you're not familiar with this movie, it's the movie Sneakers. I highly encourage everybody on this call to go watch it. Probably my favorite cyber security, hacking, cyber conflict movie of all times. And trust me, I've watched almost all of them, I'm certain. But it had a banner moment in that there's a dialogue from the character on the left where he talks about that the world isn't run by weapons anymore. It's run by information. It's run by data. And the person that controls the data and controls the information is going to be the one that is the most powerful. And we certainly have fully emerged into that domain of conflict today, where information is critical. Possession of information provides for an advantage, and information systems are valid targets of attack. And I also want to talk about the potential for cyber conflict to impact critical infrastructure and critical infrastructure targeting. So, I have here, the refinery mixed with power plant, but when we think about the escalation of cyber conflict, it is when we stop targeting just information on information systems or intellectual property or money stored on information systems, and we move into that category of a digital attack with physical consequence, where we target power grids and we cause the power to go down, or we target transportation systems and we cause aviation traffic to halt. So those become significant concerns for us over time. And when we really think about what entities might engage in a consequential critical infrastructure attack, we can narrow it down to 2 really significant ones. The first being terrorists that operate in that capacity, the other being nation states. And right now we have this unique misalignment. Would a terrorist organization go and target the power grid on the East Coast of the United States with a cyber attack if they could? Absolutely. So you see in that left bar, they have the intent. In fact, you might argue they would feel morally obligated to use that capability if they have it, but they haven't developed the capability. So that means that they aren't capable of targeting the power grid in the East Coast of the United States and taking it down. And then when we swing over to the right and we think about nation states, do nation states have the ability, a subset of them, to target the power grid on the East Coast of the United States and take it down? Absolutely. The capability exists. Do they have the intent? Well, no, they don't have the intent. There's all sorts of classical deterrents. One, fear of escalation, that we might escalate to conventional conflict and bomb them, which has been an articulated policy in the US government for 20 years, that we might respond to a cyber attack with a physical attack. economic interdependence. If they do something to our economy, it's highly likely that it's going to impact theirs as well. And then just global condemnation, right? When we operate as a global entity with multiple nation states, the global condemnation, sanctions, and lack of trade, et cetera, can also have an impact. So they don't have the intent, even though they have the capability. And as national security professionals in the future, what you need to be watching for is changes in those two dynamics. Are the terrorists developing the capability and then, likely going to use that to launch an attack? Or are there national security dynamics that are changing with the nation states that would cause them to have the intent to want to engage in an attack? So it's something to be monitoring over the long term. I also want to raise for you this concept that I call strategic penetration for future exploitation. And that is really just an acknowledgement that when it comes to national security in general, cyber attacks in particular, we need to be playing the long game. Our adversaries might be looking at our critical infrastructure and saying, I can envision a future in 10 years where I want to take the power grid down on the East Coast of the United States. I don't have the current intent. I don't want to do it. I might not ever do it, but I can envision a future scenario where there's some sort of regional conflict or something has happened where I want that arrow in my quiver. If they want that arrow in their quiver, what do they need to be doing today? They need to be penetrating those critical infrastructures in order to have the capability to attack them in the future. So I like to refer to this as adversaries having time-shifted intent. We need to think about national security and cybersecurity, not in the context of the time that we exist in now. That's important, right? Obviously, we need to understand the current geopolitics. We need to understand our current vulnerabilities, our current ways to protect ourselves. But we also need to project out into the short, mid, and far future. We need to understand how intent could shift. And if intent is going to shift, well, adversaries account for that today. And I will tell you, the first time I used this concept of time-shifted intent was about 10 or 11 years ago. I was called a little bit crazy when I told them that our infrastructure is being penetrated right now by attackers that didn't want to take it down, in the current day. And the forensics over time has proven me right again and again. We continue to discover attackers that are in our infrastructure that aren't taking it down, that are just kind of positioned there for some sort of future attack. So we need to be thinking through that. There's a quick analogy that I'll share with you that's sometimes useful for people to think about time-shifted intent. I want you to pretend that it's, prior to World War II and you're president of the United States, and your national security staff comes in and they brief you and they say, Mr. or Mrs. President, we believe that we're going to be drawn into conflict in World War II. And it'll likely, obviously be the conflict with the Germans. We have this plan. They're heavily dependent on ball bearings for the manufacture of their tanks and war-making machines. And we've developed this plan where we're going to sneak some spies into Germany and we're going to plant explosive at these ball bearing manufacturing plants. And we can do it without detection. And we don't ever have to push the button. You'll have the button on your desk. You can push the button. But if you do, it'll greatly change the dynamic of the conflict and it'll save US lives. So, Mr. and Mrs. President, would you like us to plant the explosives? I think if you're a national security realist, the obvious answer is yes, I can do it without detection. I don't ever have to use the capability. If I need it, it is going to save American lives and shorten the war. Think of cyber attack in that same context. It's a capability that they might want in the future. It might shorten some sort of conflict or it might deter some sort of conflict. So they're developing that capability now. They're planting the cyber explosives in the cyber ball bearing plant. It just happens to be that those ball bearing plants are our critical infrastructure. Last couple of points I want to make. I wrote a famous paper in 1996 called Information Terrorism, Can You Trust Your Toaster? And we got a lot of things right with that paper around how infrastructure would be targeted. We actually predicted the emergence of the Internet of Things, which a lot of people give us credit for, that your toaster would be connected to the internet. We predicted how the US government would organize to respond to this issue. So we did a lot of things right. But then at the 20-year anniversary of the paper, I sat down with the original authors and we said, okay, we know what we got right, but what did we get wrong? And the most significant finding for us was that we failed to predict that trust could be targeted as much as infrastructure could be. We kept thinking about the systems and the people, and we didn't think about that entire societies are built on concepts of trust. Our relationship with our banks are built on concepts of trust. Our relationship with the government and with fellow citizens are built on this concepts of trust. And we didn't realize that cyber attack would be such an enabler for targeting trust in our institutions and diminishing trust in those institutions. So trust is a target, and we need to think through that. When we have adversaries that are manipulating us on Facebook to get one side of a rally riled up and the other side of a rally riled up, and that we show up at the same block and start punching each other in the face, that is a diminishment of trust. They're using the platform to get us targeting each other, and we see instances of this over and over and over again. So as national security folks, what you need to think about in the future is not just what critical infrastructure can be targeted, not just what information can be targeted, but what elements of trust can be diminished. If all of a sudden, your bank says, hey, we're not sure how much money you have in your bank account, that's a violation of trust. If government is not able to provide essential services, that's a violation of trust, right? So we should be thinking about how attackers are going to target trust in the future, because we've certainly seen where they've been targeting trust over the past 5 years. And here is the challenge for your generation, and has been a challenge for my generation, but I would argue that we haven't quite lived up to the task. And that is that the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. Internet technologies, emerging technologies, provide incredible promise, they provide incredible opportunity, but they have with them inherent risks. And we need to give equal weighting, not only to the opportunity that those technologies provide, but thinking through and managing the risk. And we've done a fairly poor job of that with my generation. The gentleman who was the director of Darpa when the internet was created, for those unfamiliar, there's great history there, told me one night over beers, he was a friend, gentleman named Steve Lukasik, who's no longer with us. He said, Matt, had we known that the internet was going to be so important, we would have built security in from the beginning, but we didn't. Now I look and I say, okay, Internet of Things, we know that it's important. Why are we not building security in from the beginning? Industrial Internet of Things, these computers that are controlling our critical infrastructure. Why are we not building security in? Artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, blockchains, NFTs. We know that these are going to be foundational shifts in technologies that are going to be incredible enablers for opportunity. Why are we not addressing and managing the risk up front? So I think that is the essential challenge that we also face, is how do we derive benefits of these technologies without building the entire infrastructure on a house of cards that adversaries can exploit. So with that, that ends my formal remarks, and I am super excited to shift into the discussion and the Q&A period.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you so much for that fabulous presentation, and for a few movie tips as well. I appreciate that. Yes, welcome back to the Matrix. So with that, we have several questions teed up, but I'm going to turn it to our discussants. So Carrie, please give us your recap and your thoughts and any key questions for Matt.
Oh, well, first of all, Matt, I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I really appreciated that very much. You brought in a lot of the problems that are facing us, both on the surface and underneath things that we're not yet thinking about, and some of the trends that are happening. And I really liked your intent versus capability graph. And if we think about the terrorists, unfortunately, the price of a cyber warfare weapon is insignificant compared to the price of a physical warfare weapon. We're in a day and age where, you know, $5,000, $10,000 computer setup can bring down a $50 million jet if you get into it, right? And the cyber warfare has truly enabled the terrorists. So if we think about shifting intent, they have the intent, but they also are going to develop the capabilities very, very quickly. And this is something I think we need to be very concerned about. Similarly, I think in terms of deterrence, you know, you mentioned the economic interdependence that we have, and I'm reminded how Barbara Tuchman in The Guns of August, speaking about the World War I, and how most people were convinced that Europe was so connected, so interconnected economically, that you could not have a war in Europe that would last for more than a week or 2 weeks, because it would cause the economic collapse and nobody would go ahead and create such a war. And of course, we know that World War I did last more than a week or 2 weeks. So we have to be very aware about these deterrents. On the one hand, we've got, you know, MAD, the mutually assured destruction, that kind of played its part in the Cold War. But, you know, as you were saying, people are parking these this malware into our infrastructure the way we almost went to war with Russia over them parking nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the thing is, in those days, everybody was really scared about nuclear missiles. Today, we are still, I think, very blasé about the dangers that are out there. So I think it's wonderful that you are bringing all of this out, because the dangers are very, very real, and the deterrents become less and less, but they're certainly positioned to be out there. In terms of questions for you, I'm going to defer to the rest of the group, because I thought that was really excellently done, Matt.
Excellent. Thank you, Carrie. And I'm going to turn it over to Kevin McCarthy, if you've got a quick rejoinder, and then we've got several questions teed up in the Q&A box. So anybody, if you want to put questions in Q&A and chat, please do. I am monitoring them, and we will get to them momentarily.
And I do remember, sorry, Kevin, I'm going to jump in with one question, if I might. And yeah, because in all that I see of our cyber warfare, our cyber security, I'm still seeing a great deal of security theater as opposed to true security. I mean, came through the airport yesterday and big signs from Barracuda. Oh yeah, they'll stop all ransomware attacks. Give me a break. If they could, they would. I mean, we have so much out there that is security theater as opposed to security. How do you suggest we combat that?
Sure. There's two quick things. What you want, I'd love to just quickly address your concept around, you know, adversaries building the capability. When I do the longer version of this presentation, and I know Kevin, you've seen this, I have a slide that I call "Kill with a Borrowed Sword," and that is basically to identify that these infrastructures and capabilities that we build can be used against us by our adversaries. It's an ancient Chinese stratagem about using the capability of your adversary against you. And we need to think about that in the context of cyber and conventional attacks. And September 11th was a perfect example of kill with a borrowed sword. Those terrorists could never build missiles with the level of precision, explosive, incendiary impact to target buildings in the United States that they were able to achieve by hijacking our aviation infrastructure and commercial aircraft. We have cyber attackers who are only able to achieve their means because of tools that the US wrote at the classified level that somehow got hacked and released into the public domain. So we definitely need to be wary of that, capability changing based on technologies and infrastructures that we devise ourselves. With regards to security theater, yeah, I think it's a big issue, and I'm going to share a concept that I've been writing a paper around, so don't steal it because I haven't written it yet. And the whole reflection that I have is that we are currently in a cyber winter. And if you're not familiar with the concept, in artificial intelligence, we had a lot of hype and advancement and building of models that occurred. And then all of a sudden we went into this 20-year, what they called an AI winter, where we really didn't have innovation. Things seemed to stagnate, and we didn't progress at all. I would make the argument that the past 20 years we've been stuck in a cyber winter. Our development of security technologies has been incremental and evolutionary, not revolutionary. CrowdStrike, great company, have friends that work there, they've done great things. It's an advancement of a technology that we had 20 years ago. Two-factor authentication, a layer that we put on top of passwords. So I think really to move beyond the theater, we're going to have to think about what does true innovation look like? What does true disruption look like? How do we rewrite some of the things that we've just assumed will always be parts of the infrastructure to take them out? Whether that be identity, whether that be how network traffic flows. So there is a huge challenge there, and I'm not sure how to address it other than it's going to take a grander vision, and it's going to take trying some things that are going to fail, that are going to be very disruptive to move us to new models of how infrastructure and security work.
Well, without saying any more, you're going to really like Critica, but we can take that offline.
Excellent. Kevin, McCarthy, I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you very much. Matt, thanks again for a great presentation. I've been leaning on your wise advice for 20 years now. Since post 9/11, we were striving to protect the aviation industry. And back then we talked about security theater when the new TSA was doing physical security, and we all knew
Sure.
it was somewhat of a joke. Coming forward to today, now looking at the threats that we've heard hypothesized, if you will, around 5G and Huawei, and given that the CFO Meg Wanzhou was recently released and returned back to China to a rather glorious reception, does that enhance your consideration that 5G is and Huawei is presenting a clear and present danger?
Yeah, I think it definitely highlights an issue around, this concept of supply chain integrity. And we think about 5G and network infrastructure as being part of the supply chain by how which, internet services and communication is being delivered. And we really need to be thinking hard about how do we ensure the integrity of those systems. So that's definitely one element of it. When you have, what is the equivalent of, a state beholden, state sponsored entity that has benefited from intellectual property theft from Western innovation and taking a product to market where we don't have the ability to do the integrity checks on the source code, et cetera, that does become a concern, right? It becomes almost a Trojan horse type issue where do you want to build a critical capability on top of an infrastructure for which you can't account for the integrity of the infrastructure parts, right? So that's definitely one key component of it. Even just taking away the espionage angle and the potential for siphoning or monitoring of traffic, if we just think about it from a denial of service perspective, certainly presents a tremendous risk. I think that what has been interesting around COVID with regards to non-health impacts, right? I mean, obviously it's been a horrible experience based on the public health impacts, has been the highlighting of the supply chain issues, dependency on foreign chip manufacturers. I went car shopping here in Northern Virginia, and much like I couldn't find gas during the Colonial Pipeline attack, I couldn't find a car to buy. Like we literally could not find a car to buy, and we had multiple models that we were considering, within a certain class amongst multiple dealers. Northern Virginia is very populous. There's a lot of car dealers. They just didn't have the inventory on the lot. So we need to be thinking about, what is critical for the advancement of our own technology future, and how do we make sure that we have supply chain integrity? We don't have sole sources of dependencies, and certainly that we're not building dependencies on nations that we know have adversarial intent, or are building technologies that are viewed as being national security. I don't want to call them weapons, but national security capabilities in the future.
Okay, so
Excellent.
looking at that from kind of logistics angle, the reverse logistics of the Bitcoin network. And I know you're an expert on this, and there are some people out there now saying that actually the Bitcoin digital currency transactions are not as hidden as we may be led to believe in the civilian world, that we can see where it's going. Is that a fact? And is that an avenue to help shut down the ransomware attacks?
It is. I mean, by nature, Bitcoin and blockchain are transparent, right? The transaction record is shared amongst all the participants in the network. The analytics on that become a little bit, computational heavy. And then where we run into problems is where stuff moves off of the Bitcoin network into exchanges and into fiat currencies. But you are seeing that, we have been able to acquire, access to transactions and get back money that was paid in ransomware or money that was stolen. We have seen some of these exchanges being sanctioned, similar to the way that we would sanction a bank that was allowing for attackers to siphon monies through. So the transparency of the network is certainly a reality. It just becomes a mechanism of where that network touches other financial networks. How do we make sure that we're monitoring through that? So yeah, I'm a big fan of Bitcoin. I'm on my 10th year. Mined my first Bitcoin 10 years ago. I've stayed very closely aligned with the developments. There have been a ton of developments. It's hard to keep pace, but it is transparent, and there is stuff that we are and can be doing to help try and make it more difficult for the perpetration of some of these ransomware payments.
And finally, you have a wonderful quote about cyberwar that you haven't used. I think you ought to share it with
Well,
you.
it was in the bio, I think, right? Which is that you can hack your way into a cyber war, but you've got to shoot your way out. And that really is just an acknowledgement of the fact that we think about cyber as being something separate, and not attached to regular warfare. And the reality is the stakes are so high that any significant cyber attack is going to escalate into conventional attacks. We might be faced with an adversary in which a cyber attack is not going to have parity based on what they're able to accomplish against us, or in which lives are lost, or the economy is drastically impacted, in which case we want to reserve the right to engage in conventional attacks. So I am of the belief that it's highly likely the first real cyber conflict will also involve conventional conflict.
Thank you. I yield back.
Excellent. Thank you very much, panelists. Matt, we have several questions teed up. I'm going to try and put them in groups here. So let me start with a little bit of what you were just touching on, which is concerns about AI, and particularly the concept of AI malware being learning its adaptation to security measures. Is that something that security organizations are taking on at the level that you think is necessary right now? Yeah,
so that's a great question, something that's near and dear to my heart because I've put a lot of energy into it over the past couple of years. There's two aspects of that. First is, how do we ensure the integrity of our own AI systems, right? And that is one of those where we've got to build security in from the beginning. We have to make sure that the infrastructure that those AI capabilities are running on is secure. We need to make sure that the algorithms are secure but also fair. And all models require training data, so we need to make sure that the training data is of high integrity and not subjected to what we would call kind of adversarial machine learning, where our adversaries are trying to impact the operation of our own AI by giving it bad data, by giving it bad signals. So some huge challenges there with regards to making sure that we derive benefit from AI while also making it secure. The flip of that is how will attackers use AI capabilities in the future to better engage in attacks? And I think that is also a trend that we will see. There was a great challenge that took place with DARPA a few years ago called the Darpa Cyber Grand Challenge, where they basically had a competition to see who could build the best autonomous attack and defend. I don't call it an AI, but it was like an AI supercomputer. And they brought the 6 finalists to DEF CON, the largest hacker conference in the world, and they had them compete in what we call a capture the flag. And that is that we built an isolated network with all these targets on it, and we disconnected it from everything else, and we put the AIs on there and we let them battle against each other. And they performed rather admirably. So they were able to attack, they were able to find vulnerabilities that humans hadn't. So we need to be wary of those capabilities starting to be used to target our systems, and thinking about how we automate defense, and how we be tracking the development of those capabilities over time. One of my favorite findings from the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, you have the 6 finalists. The machines have been given the rules of engagement, and of course, humans weren't allowed to talk on that network. It was kept completely isolated. In fact, the only way that we knew what was happening was there was logging that was being done to a Blu-ray writer, and they had this cool robotic arm, and it would pick up the Blu-ray and it would move it across, and it would put it on a different network, and then we would see the score. We would see what was happening. Well, they told these machines that at noon on Friday is when the contest starts. One of the systems was sophisticated or unsophisticated enough to look and say, I've been told that I need to win this contest. I've been told it starts at noon, but I haven't been told that there's a penalty for starting before noon. So it cheated and started the attacks early before the other systems were on board, right? So even then, it engaged in behavior that the creators did not intend. So as we have attackers that start to create this, AI that's capable of building its own malware and attacking systems, we need to be very concerned, over just ways that it adapts on its own or behaviors that it engages in that we haven't anticipated.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you for that. Pulling a thread on that before we move into some questions about adversaries, is the lack of security by design? And it's a question that's asked, and I think it's a legitimate question because of the way that the high-tech industry evolved, the way software evolved. It was supposed to be this, push things out fast and break things, all those models. Was the lack of security really something that we just didn't pay attention to, or was it something that we ignored because it made the advancement of various other aspects of capabilities more attractive?
There are 2 aspects of that. I think in the early days, it was a failure of education, right? Where the people making the decisions on whether to spend on security weren't aware of what the consequences were. Now it really is, it's purposefully, they're intentionally deciding not to fund security to the extent that it needs to be funded, or to think that security is something that you address after the product is developed. There's a great story I like to tell about, was hired, or we were bidding for a hacking team to do an assessment. So we were going to try and hack into a satellite system that was providing internet communications over satellite. And we were being hired by the company that built these satellites. So we went in, we met with them, we wrote a proposal, we made the 3 finalists, we went in and did a verbal briefing. We had the final proposal in, we won. We went and did the kickoff meeting. We walked out of the customer location with 800 pages worth of manuals. We went back to our offices, we looked at the manuals of how this satellite was designed and the software was running, and we went back to the customer and we said, hey, we're ready, we need access to this satellite in the lab, or in an environment where we can start to do some real assessment against it. And I, to this day, will never forget the executive at the company saying, "What do you mean you need access to the lab?" Well, you hired us. You're paying us hundreds of thousands of dollars to find the security vulnerabilities in the satellite. We can only do that if you give us access to it. So the satellite's in space already. We went through this whole process of us thinking they were engaging us prior to launching the satellite. They were thinking they were hiring us to improve the security of the satellite already in space. And I had to break it to the executive that our ability to improve the security of that satellite was greatly diminished by the fact that it was already in space, right? So that is a conversation we're having, not just with satellites, but with IoT systems and routers and connected cars, et cetera, is that we're not thinking about security as part of the design process, and that has been deliberate by nature because of the cost associated with it, the delays associated with it, wanting to get first to market, et cetera. It's been a deliberate choice, and it's contributed to this house of cards perspective that we have.
Wow, that's quite an example. Thank you for that. Let's switch back. Before we come back, I have a group of other questions about the security aspects, but let's switch to the adversaries here. You talked about, and I loved your intent versus capability slide. I thought that was spot on. Where are the non-state actors getting the human resources, the capabilities, the digital know-how to really carry out cyber attacks? And do you see that as something that is likely to accelerate their ability to acquire capabilities in the future, or has it been substantially degraded? And obviously, top of everybody's mind right now are organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIL and those groups.
Sure. So, from a cyber crime perspective, the capabilities are pretty native to the ecosystem. There's a lot of smart people in which the financial incentives are aligned with criminal activity and for which there are no deterrents. If you are a cyber criminal in Russia targeting systems in the United States, there's no way you're going to wind up in jail, right? So it's a great way to, make a lot of money instead of having a 9-to-5 day job writing code. So there's some great capability there. The terrorist organizations, we haven't seen them developing really great technical capability, but what we worry about is this issue of convergence, where the terrorists start collaborating with the criminals, or they start acquiring tools off of these criminal markets on the dark web, et cetera, or a gathering capability. So when we think about the terrorist development of capability, we need to think of it in the context not of organic development as much as we do about convergence with other threat actors. We also, as I mentioned earlier, need to think about it in the context of this kill with a borrowed sword. If there's sophisticated nation state or pair of nation states that launch an attack like Stuxnet that targeted Iranian nuclear centrifuges, and those tools that they use, which are very sophisticated 0 days, they're vulnerabilities for which no patch exists, get released into the public domain, it doesn't take long for bad actors to weaponize them and point those targets back at us. So we need to be also thinking very deliberately about what does it mean for us to have an offensive cyber tool arsenal? In what context do we use it? How do we protect it? Are there, and the US government has built what they call a vulnerability equities program, which they are trying to determine, okay, we found a vulnerability. Do we use this as a tool in an offensive, cyber capability attack or offensive espionage, or in the common good of the infrastructure in the private sector, do we work with the vendor to publish a patch, right, and take that tool out of the equation? So lots of dynamics there, but bad actors have smart people. We're giving them tools every day in a variety of mechanisms and high probability for convergence where they start working together.
That's great. And you touched on the offensive cyber war capabilities as something that's necessary to have in addition to our defensive shoring up the infrastructure. Let's go to an old conventional threat that's near and dear to my heart. Are you still concerned about EMPs, electromagnetic pulse? devices being a substantial threat. Obviously, that's that falls in the category of physical on digital, physical on physical.
Sure. Yeah. It's certainly something that I think we need to be thinking about. I'm not as concerned today, and interestingly, I was the one that put EMP on like the FBI and part of the national security community's radar screen. Maybe like 30 years ago. Still remember the first time being cited in the FBI's patterns of global terrorism on that topic. So it's something I've looked at. I'm not as concerned, just given the capability that's required. If a nation state uses EMP, that's a conventional attack. There's no way around it, right? And I think we would respond accordingly. But terrorists developing a capability for an EMP, I think, is possible, but not hugely impactful, at large scale. And then the other issue being that since we've built all of these infrastructures with this dependency on computer systems and computer networks, an EMP might not be the most effective way to target critical infrastructure. There might be more efficient kind of pure cyber means that don't require the EMP that achieve the same effect. And I think a lot of adversaries have focused their attention there as a result. So still a concern, still something that we need to be thinking about and putting in the context, and especially as it relates to kind of the I&W matrix around adversary capability development, that we're monitoring for that. But I'm concerned about a lot of other threats a lot more these days, just given how soft I know the infrastructure is.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, our thinking on that topic has evolved substantially over the decades.
Yeah.
Talk to us back to the security concept. Talk to us about your thoughts on the concept of the good worm. Something that you let loose, it's learning, it crawls through your IoT devices, it fixes bad bugs, and if it can't fix them, it does what it can to shut them down. Is that a concept that is safe, secure, or is it one we should be exceedingly concerned about?
All things have risk of unintended consequences, right? And we saw that with the first internet worm, which was designed simply to try and count how many computers are connected to the internet, and resulted in a pretty massive denial of service attack at the time. That said, we do need to address how we build automation into cyber defense. We don't have the human labor force in order to be able to combat all of the threats that we are encountering. The deficiencies are anywhere from 300,000 to 3 million, depending on who you talk to. The attackers are automating their attack platforms. These networks are big and vast and operate at machine speed. So what we need to determine is what are the machine speed defensive capabilities that we want to deploy. Having an automated patch software that is appropriately tested, that can go and eliminate some of these vulnerabilities that might be used from ransomware could be a good thing, especially as it relates to public internet facing assets, right? We saw an attack against Microsoft Exchange servers recently, in which the systems were exposed on the internet for months. Where an attacker discovering it had already been compromised and was sitting out there just waiting to be further exploited. Having an automated system that went through and patched those systems or removed that vulnerability, I think would be a useful thing, or would help diminish the impact. That said, we've just got to be very deliberate about how we develop these capabilities and how we test them, and kind of the parameters that we put on them. So. Excellent,
thank you, Matt. I'm gonna close with one question for you, which is really talking about the big state actor adversaries we're facing right now, and I'm just going to condense it down to whether China and Russia. What are we worried about? Who are we most worried about? And in your time sequenced,
time shifted, yeah.
Time shifted, thank you. Time shifted intent. Who are we most concerned about? How do you address those two state actors as we look out into the future?
Yeah, they're very unique culturally, at this point, capability-wise. I mean, there's some unique dynamics there. So I'll put it in the context of how I frame it. very concerned about Russia as kind of a near-term cyber peer attack adversary, given the corruption within the government, given the capability that they have, given the kind of the regional power projection that they're attempting to, the test bed that we've seen of, testing of cyber capabilities in the Ukraine, et cetera. So it's a less stable regime with, intent basically to, have greater political power in the global superpower quest, right? So it's a little bit of a diminished power that's rebuilding and just reckless enough to engage in cyber attacks. So concern there, and we've seen that, right? We've seen some overt attacks that have broken norms. We've seen lots of things that have happened that have been difficult to digest. So from a short-term perspective, very interesting there. And then kind of a near-term perspective, I think the Russians have been very transparent for over 20 years with regards to how they were going to use information warfare to include the psychological manipulation. And they've followed that to a T. So whatever they're saying right now about the use of those capabilities in the future, we should be paying attention to and trying to protect against. And as it relates to Russian attacks, I think the biggest cyber defense initiative that we need to figure out is how do we protect the cognitive infrastructure? How do we protect manipulation up here amongst, a large population of citizens and a rule of law that can be, can get a little crazy at times, given the democratic nature of it. China's playing a long game. So, we need to think of it in the context of that. So a little less overt in their attentions, a little less destructive, really thinking about, how is cyber attack capability going to benefit them over the long term, which is why we saw a very early focus of their national attack capabilities focused on intellectual property theft. They wanted to reach innovation parity with countries like the United States on defense technologies and biomedical and 5G networking, et cetera. So they were very focused on stealing those technologies, getting them inside their society, being able to replicate and advance their own society. That said, they have a global power strategy as well with the Belt and Road and expansion into other regions of the world, including Africa, and are willing to use cyber attack in order to facilitate that. So less of a near-term disruptive threat, definitely a long-term strategic threat. And the Russians, I would say, would fall more into kind of the near-term disruptive piece of it. So, and my ability to predict the world is, is subject to change day to day.
Yes, but it's been quite good.
and it has shifted. I have been successful at shifting attention as required, year over year, as we've seen as kind of the dynamics of these adversaries change over time.
Excellent, Matt. Well, thank you so much. Before we close, I just want to give our audience an opportunity to know how they can learn more about your work, your papers, your activities. I put the devo.net link in the chat box, but could you give them an idea of how else they may learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, Devo.net is great. I know that at least a couple of you are subscribed to my newsletter. I just put the link in the chat. Actually, just went to the panelists only. So if you could put that in the public chat for me. I do a newsletter every Sunday that I call the Global Frequency. It's just globalfrequency.com, where I'm tracking what I think are the most important cybersecurity, AI, kind of general tech trends. So it's hand curated by me, as well as books. So every week I provide a book recommendation. So, as you're trying to expand your body of knowledge or get exposed to new ideas, that's a great resource. And then of course, following me on Twitter and other social medias, also a good way to stay in touch. Twitter, I'm just at Matt Devo, so pretty easy to find as well.
Excellent, excellent. So for everybody on, I just put the link again. It's globalfrequency.com. I highly recommend it. It is very informative. The weekly newsletter really keeps you apprised of some key things that are going on. And I wish I could read all your book recommendations, Matt, but it's hard to keep up with you. So,
Yes, it requires a lot of discipline on my part to be able to recommend a book every week. So.
Excellent. I thank you very much for your time and for joining us. This was a fascinating presentation. I thank both of our panelists, Carrie and Kevin, for joining us as well. And remember, everybody, NSFers, we hope to see you either on Zoom or in person on the 12th of October. You will get that announcement tomorrow. So with that, take care, everybody. Be safe.
Thanks to everybody signing up. I can see the new signups coming across as alerts on my screen. So
excellent.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
It was great
Bye-bye.
to see you all.
Thanks, Matt. Great to see you.